and welcome to the Safety Brief. Today, we're tackling a topic that has been making headlines more and more, and that's cloud service outages and the chaos they create for businesses. We rely on the cloud for almost everything, from email to data storage, remote work, and even security itself. But when a major cloud provider goes down, it's more than just an inconvenience. It can also be a security nightmare. Joining me today to break this down is Mike and Matt. As always, thank you both for being here.
You bet.
So let's start with the big question here. Why are cloud outages becoming such a major concern? I mean, we've seen AWS, Microsoft, and even Google Cloud all have massive service disruptions in the recent years. But it's not just about the downtime, right? There are some security risks tied to these outages as well. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, I think, the most obvious of the factors being that the initial appeal or the marketing shtick of moving resources or infrastructure to the cloud was reliability, was uptime, was low maintenance, was, you didn't have to worry about it. And so, now that, we see more and more infrastructures more commonly found built in either SaaS environments, through Office 365. You're not hosting email on-prem as much anymore. Again, it was the appeal was, hey, pay this monthly, annual, whatever subscription-based fee, and we'll handle it. You don't got to worry about it, right? The headache's off your plate. And that seems to no longer be the case. The new headache is introduced, right? And it's which vendor is more reliable, and not just to mention reliability and uptime, but as you mentioned already, Elizabeth, is the security of that cloud or SaaS environment.
Yeah, I'd also like to point out one of the biggest risks I've seen is that when a cloud provider does go down, IT teams tend to scramble to set up workarounds. And sometimes those workarounds involve bypassing security policies or disabling MFA or opening up VPN access to compensate, which basically creates a new attack surface altogether. So, if relying on one cloud provider is risky, what can businesses do to prevent a total shutdown when their provider goes offline? Should they be looking at spreading things out?
You have to have redundancy. You cannot have total reliance on a singular point of anything, otherwise, you're just asking to get screwed. Things go down, you don't have access, business comes to a halt, you're losing income, you're losing revenue. What do you do at that point? You have to have something in place that allows business continuity in the event that Microsoft's itself. Let's be honest. When you have no email, 90% of what a lot of roles do each day is non-existent anymore. And nobody's going to pick up the phone and call somebody. That's why they use email, because they don't want to talk to somebody on the phone. They want to send an email that can be answered at some other point, come back to their mailbox, and they can pretend they didn't see it. If you call them, you have to talk to them, which means you have to do things right then. So having something in place that gives you redundancy, some form of backup, is going to be extremely helpful. Now, with mail providers, that kind of gets a little bit difficult because you're not exactly going to go from having, Office 365 to saying, okay, everybody use your Gmail accounts. You're just going to end up getting a hell of a lot more calls for people asking, why am I getting an email from somebody's Gmail account? Which still could have an issue on the back end anyways. But you need redundancy. Redundancy is a good thing.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
No, you're good. No, I think I think just when it comes back to when you were mentioning more of the when uptime or reliability issues come up, then workarounds are in place. I think it's no different than a fire drill. Metaphorically speaking, you got to plan for it. Nobody wants it to happen. Nobody likes it when it happens, if it happens, or prays it happens. But having disaster recovery or business continuity planning is an important part of maintaining that resilience. We saw a lot of that, the fruit of a lot of that labor get picked off the tree in 2019, 2020, 2021, when people got, asked to set up an office in their home. Maybe not everybody had a space for that, or a machine for that, or internet connection reliability enough for that. And so, in Chicago, I worked with a number of companies where they would have to simulate, hey, there's a snowstorm, there's a blizzard, you can't make it to the office today. How are you getting work done? And this is 2016, 2017, when I was doing this in with a lot of companies. And it was just a matter of, hey, you had to think about, hey, what are the assumptions we have in our daily workflow that, hey, this is going to work? What happens if Slack goes down? Definitely if your voice, your VoIP provider goes down. How are you communicating? How are you still taking calls? How are you still doing business? It's no different than, you're running a car wash. What happens if the water shuts off? What happens if the power shuts off, right? Like, what contingencies are there? And you got to admit where your risk is your risk. Hey, if we have no power, we're not doing business, right? Or we need backup power, we need redundancy, like Matt was saying. And so it's just a matter of, you got to choose what your acceptable level of downtime is in the event of something like that happening. And when that happens, you look at it and you have this run book and you say, hey, we planned for this, right? Here's what would happen if users couldn't physically be in the office. Here's what would happen if the office was taken off the map, right? There's a flood in the server room or whatever, so it's just a matter of, you got to really put intentional effort into, number one, bolstering your defenses. But after that, I think, building a business continuity plan so that it's not we're building this process as it's happening.
It's not just cloud that you have to be worried about. So we were talking about business continuity and having a backup plan in place. I live in a place where we honestly don't get cold weather that frequently. There are occasions we get this stuff called ice. Now, people down here can't drive when it's sunny out. They suck when it's rainy. I can promise you this, you don't want to be on the road with them when there is ice. Everybody else is putting along at 2 miles an hour. I'm drifting around in my car having fun because I'm used to this stuff. It's second nature for me. But what happens when you don't have a laptop for work and you can't get into the office? Now, a lot of businesses don't have the forethought to look at the weather ahead of time and plan for this. Back when I worked at another company, their plan was everybody that had a laptop, go home. Fantastic. I love that plan. I didn't have a laptop. I only had a desktop at the office because they were too cheap to actually buy people laptops. So we had crappy desktops that barely functioned that we were using. The weather was getting worse. I track weather for fun. I told them there's an expectation that we should see about a half inch to an inch of ice by the time we get out of the office at 7 o'clock that night. Their response was, we don't think it's going to be that bad, and we're willing to take that chance on your safety. Great. Well, get out of the office, and there is about a quarter inch of ice on the windshield of the car. The entire parking lot is a sheet of ice. Oh, by the way, it's not a flat parking lot. You have to go uphill to try and get out of the parking lot. So they made everybody that didn't have a laptop stay. Everybody else went home. They were comfortable. Well, because there was ice, I went home that night. I drove on the ice, got home, not a problem. The next morning, they say, well, why aren't you in the office? And I said, well, there's ice on the ground. My driveway is at roughly a 14-degree angle, and there's ice. Well, they expected us to be in the building. Not going to happen. I told them, you can gladly send somebody to come pick me up, but otherwise I'm not coming in. They had no contingency for that. They did not plan for that. Although amazingly, right after that, everybody got laptops. So it took an issue for them to think about that and get that redundancy in place. And that's why you can't have a reliance on just a singular thing. Have a physical desktop that works. Have something that gives you the ability to do things remotely as well if it comes down to it. We all have our phones that have email attached to them. We all have multiple computers and tablets. At least if you work in any kind of tech, I promise you have more electronic crap in your house than your spouse probably wants to admit to having in the house. That's all there. It all gives you a capability that you can connect in some way, shape, or form. You can do the basics of what you need and you have functionality.
Mm-hmm.
If you have remote desktop, you have the capability that even using a terrible computer, you can still log into your computer safely and do what you need to do. Those are the types of things you need. You need to have that kind of redundancy in place so that you can keep everybody functioning. Don't have that reliance on that singular point of failure, because when you do that, it's going to fail. And then you fail as a company. And then everybody's unhappy together.
Yeah, strategy is very important, but even with the strong strategy, security gaps can creep in. So, how often should companies actually audit their cloud security, and what are the biggest red flags they should be looking for?
I hate the whole how often should they be doing it, because that makes it seem like there is an arbitrary time period that you should only be looking at it. It should be an all the time thing. When should
Hmm.
you do regular audits of it? At
Regularly?
minimum, like, I mean, the furthest out I would say you should wait would be quarterly. You should never go more than a quarter without doing a full scale audit of what's going on in your perimeter, in your environment, with all of your services. Help identify all of that. However, you should be regularly looking. You have a team that's capable of doing that. You have a SOC that should be looking to see if there's anything that is out of the ordinary. The only way you're going to find things, and we talk about failure, it may not be a provider going down. Guess what happens if your company or somebody at your company says something retarded and it gets leaked out? You have a bunch of justice warriors that show up. They will bomb your site. They will find a way to take you offline, and you will think that it is your provider having the issue, but it's not your provider. They're just bombing your network so heavily that you can't do anything. You will appear as though you are offline. If you don't have a SOC that's actually actively monitoring, you're not going to catch all of those attacks that are coming in. You're not going to find a way to say, okay, we got to get around this. There are solutions in place. Large companies use them. It's, having the equivalent of a DNS pool that's out there. So if you try to send an attack to, let's use BattleNet as an example, because it always seems to go down, or PlayStation Network, they always go down. They've gotten smart, and they now have redundancies in place to where if X amount of data is going to this one area, it's balancing and sending it so that not one object is getting overloaded and then going offline.
Yeah, as far as like frequency, I think it's important that you're actively taking inventory of what those vulnerabilities are, but it's not like you can scan today and scan next week and you're going to already have a enough done in that time to justify another scan. So I agree, quarterly or biannually, twice a year rather, is important. Now, I would say, as far as how often you engage things like penetration testing, I think candidly, a lot of companies engage penetration testing companies too early on before
Mm-hmm.
they've really battened down the hatches. And, that's fine. They're donating their money to the pen testers because it's like, okay, great. I didn't lock my door. I didn't do anything. This sounds cool. Pen testing sounds cool. So let me go drop a couple G's on it. It's unnecessary most of the time if you have not done a full, exhaustive, external, internal, and east west scanning, vulnerability scan. And it's important to take a full assessment of your house and consider the state of it, and simply look at, number one, you should know the risks that is going to show up on that pen test, right? You should know
Mhm.
the entry points. You should know those things before you contract a pen tester, because they're going to take the path of least resistance. They're not going to show you every path in. They're going to show you the path in they took. And it's very single threaded in that way, right? And so I would say to those organizations that are kind of at that place where they've, deployed email security, endpoint security, network security, they have a lot of confidence over the top three or the most common. Then there's maybe a use case to explore, exhaustive assessments. But, I'd say most of the time you should be running full vulnerability assessments, I'd say, every 6 months. And then because you're going to need to do something with those results. And that's the most, how do I say, the least frequently executed on part of those vulnerability scans. A lot of people do them.
Correct.
A lot of people find out what the results are, but don't bank in the time, effort, energy to shore up the gaps that are illuminated by that. And so, again, don't just do the scan, but it sounds obvious, but action the results, shore up what you can, and then certainly engage a penetration tester and so on and so forth. But I think about 75% of companies that engage a penetration testing company do it too early on.
And then when you do those vulnerability scans, when Mike was saying you need to action them, don't just look at the list and start with number one and go down the list. You need to prioritize them. You have to actually take inventory of what is being reported to you. You need to classify them based on their overall severity. If you get something and it's only impacting one user versus something that has the potential to impact the entire organization, which one do you think you should be actioning first? You want to shore up the biggest holes that have the largest impact and work your way down. Once you get to that point where you're working on the onesies, the twosies, those kinds of things, generally that's when you could start looking at doing a black box pen test.
Mhm.
And yes, you want black box. You do not want to give anybody the schematics to your kingdom. You
It's
do
not
not
a
want to, yeah, you don't want to invite them in and say, "Hey, you're in. What do you see?" Okay, well, if I'm going to invite the bad guys in, I'm not going to ask them what they see, because they're just going to point out one tiny thing, but they're going to keep the rest in their mind and say, "We can get in using these things too down the road." Have them, give them, if you do black box with anything like that, you're not giving them anything. You're basically saying, "Here's the company, figure it out." That's going to give you the best thing, because as they're doing their testing, they're going to provide you the report of what they did. They're going from nothing. You're going to be able to see what it's like when an actual adversary is trying to access your environment. If they're successful, you've got a lot of work to do. They may get successful up to a certain point. Less work to do. If they can't get in, period, congratulations. You're one of the few companies that actually took your security training seriously.
I
And
love
you're not
that.
reliant on needing, as much in the form of redundancy, because you're probably not going to have things taken offline, which is positive.
So we got a little off topic there, but I will say a short plug here. If you would like to learn more about penetration testing or vulnerability scans, we do have quite a bit of blogs and recent safety brief episodes that you can dig into at blockworks.com as well, or feel free to drop your questions in the comments and we'd be happy to answer any of them for you. But I think it's also important to point out that we've also seen time and time again that misconfigurations are the biggest reason cloud breaches happen. It's not always some advanced attack or someone sitting in their basement. Sometimes it's just leaving something open that shouldn't be.
Or putting
So,
something where it shouldn't be.
yeah.
I still go back to the Microsoft thing.
Mhm.
Accidentally uploading all of that information to a public GitHub instead of their internal GitHub. It's
Human
a
error.
huge error, but it can happen. 100% that can happen.
Yep.
What about the CrowdStrike thing? Failure of validation. Took how many people offline and they had no redundancy plan in place? They had no way to really recover from that. There were companies that were down for days.
Yeah, we went into that topic as well on a recent safety brief episode, and that really tied into strategy, putting together a strategy for releasing updates and things of that nature. So yeah, that's a huge topic as well. So, well, let's move on here. Let's say that the worst happens, right? Cloud services go down. What is the first thing IT teams should be looking out for from a security standpoint in that scenario?
Depends on which cloud you're looking at, what cloud provider went down.
Let's
I
use the
mean,
most recent example. Microsoft goes down. What should IT teams be focusing on at that point?
I think again, it just comes back to what business functions are critical. This is going to be a little redundant, but it comes back to the business continuity plan of, hey, what functions are business critical, email, etc. Uh, what can we do without for an hour or two, and what can we not do without for an hour or two, and then we have to find reliable ways to keep those functions online. Right? It's going to look very different if you're um, an 8 to 5 shop than if you're a manufacturing plant and you have a conveyor belt running 24/7. And so it's certainly a broad question, but I think specifically each organization is going to look at their business need. What is their acceptable impact? What could they endure with minimal pain, to the bottom line and revenue stream? And then from there, okay, what are our compensating controls when this happens? The best example is, you go on a plane, you go on a cruise ship, right? There are lifeboats, there are flotation devices, there are doors, right? Like there are compensating controls if things that run normally and function reliably 365 days a year, if some of those things go down, we need compensating controls. Every cruise ship goes out, doesn't plan on using the lifeboats. They still need to bring them, right? They still
Yeah.
need to check them. They still need to inspect them. They still need to have every single passenger on board go through here's your path, here's your walkway, here's your right. It's just, again, they're doing all of those things. They've paid and invested money in the compensating controls. They're not cheap. They're not cheap to maintain. And I think that's going to be a big underscore here is that, building in resiliency and redundancy will cost money. It's going to have a difficult time calculating the dollars and cents value of redundancy. A lot of people are going to look at this and be like, well, that's expensive. You have to ask yourself, what is it like to go offline for 24 hours? What does our revenue stream look like if we go offline for 24, 48, 72 hours, right? And so that's why we talk to a lot of businesses around prevention-centric cybersecurity controls. And to be on the proactive side, there's a lot of due diligence that's needed. There's a lot of things to think about that, left brain, right brain, when you're thinking of preventative versus response driven, you'd never think about. You'd never think about if you weren't in a prevention-centric mindset. What does it come back to? There's a difficult time to, again, outline the return on investment, but you have to think about what am I quantifyingly mitigating the chance of in the way of revenue stream miss during downtime. And so for those organizations that have cloud hosted sources or SaaS, one, the other, or both, they need to look at, hey, what are critical controls that we have positioned in these places, meaning things outside our control, right? If you're hosting your email, that's in your control. You got to make sure power's there. You got to make sure internet's there. You got to make sure everything's there. If you're putting it in the cloud, you're taking that responsibility off, but you're putting the focal point of risk on said cloud provider. And a lot of things, will be different when you look at, the difference between residential ISPs and business ISPs, right? There's an SLA involved. There's hey, you're going to have this guarantee of minimum downtime, right? And cloud providers are the same. You're going to pay for uptime. You're going to pay for reliability. You're going to pay for redundancy. No different than if you deploy, a physical firewall into a server rack. You paid for one. We have partners that have what's called HA, and they have two of them sitting there. One of them is just powered on, doing nothing all day, ready to take over the load in the event that the first one just physically has a hardware malfunction. And so, again, what that's going to look like per organization is going to vary greatly. But the first conversation and the theme that this keeps coming back to is you have to inventory your critical business controls as it pertains to technology. You have to then identify where do those controls exist and how are we able to influence their reliability. And if they're in the cloud, you pay your bill. That's as much as you can do. right? If they're physically in your server room, then there's much more you can do, right? But I think, again, number one, you got to inventory where your critical controls are. What can we not continue to generate revenue as a business without? And then two, where are those controls? What can we influence? What can we not? And then three, specifically in those that you cannot, what are you going to do if they evaporate, right? And it's just an honest dialogue, right?
Yeah.
Now, while Mike is bringing all of that up, and those are things that need to be focused on, from the security side, there's also something that you have to think about. Whenever an outage occurs like that, there's going to be opportunistic people that are going to take advantage of said outage. We talked about using a personal email earlier. Well, guess what? A lot of people can be found by their personal email. A lot of people have business accounts that also, for some reason, have their personal email tied to them. So, one of the biggest things that from a security standpoint, I'd be looking at are provider goes down, say it's Microsoft, getting emails sent to people's personal email addresses saying, hey, we noticed there's an outage. Click here to check the status. Well, it's not actually a status message from Microsoft, but it's somebody who's wanting you to go in there and then pretend to log in with your Microsoft credentials, even though they're technically down at that point, and they now have the information. And when it comes back up, you're not going to know that they're logging into your account and taking all of your stuff. So something just to be, just to look at.
Yeah, it's a common theme during this episode, but we've also spoken a lot about how attackers love to exploit chaos. Anytime that there's any kind of confusion or chaos going on, whether it's in the office, in your home life, or just globally, we see a surge in attacks, and that's without a doubt. So. Well, this has been such an important conversation because let's be real, cloud outages aren't going away and businesses need to prepare. So if you're listening and thinking, I need to get my cloud security in order, Blockworks can help. If you want to learn more, let's set up a quick discovery call where Blockworks can share how we can fit into your security stack. Email us at sales@blockworks.com or drop a comment and we will be in touch to talk to you about cloud security strategies today. Thank you again to our guests, and thank you all for tuning in to another episode of the Safety Brief. Stay secure, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks all.